Yes, everyone, this is Devin Rose. I got a question sent to me through my YouTube channel. Someone had commented on one of the other videos I made and asked if I would do another video giving arguments for the Catholic Church with regard to the fact that the Catholic Church says, this is what's true. Especially in regard to how do you interpret the Bible, versus Protestantism, where you have multiple hundreds, thousands of different and often conflicting, contradictory interpretations of the Bible. So what are the arguments for kind of the, if you will, the Catholic Church's one interpretation of the Scriptures versus Protestantism's many? That's one way of couching it. And so thought we'd tackle that. So I've got my computer here to help me remember all my notes. First thing to consider is the law of non-contradiction. And that's what says contradictory statements cannot both at the same time be true. We're going to see how that comes into play later. This is a very elementary law and everyone knows it even if they've not been taught it before. So first let's look at the Catholic Church and how she interprets the Scriptures. So firstly, it's important to realize that the Catholic Church doesn't have a big book somewhere that has an infallible interpretation of every single verse in the Scriptures. That doesn't exist, and nor will it ever exist. It's just not the way that the Holy Spirit leads the Church, and not really the purpose of the Scriptures also. So instead, the Church gives 3 guidelines for reading and interpreting the Scriptures, and you can find these in the Church document called Dei Verbum. And that's be especially attentive to the unity and content and unity of the whole Scriptures. So take all the Scriptures as a whole. It's not just dividing them up and analyzing each one of the books in its own, kind of separate, isolated context. The second one is to read the Bible within the living tradition of the Church. 2,000 years of Church Fathers, Church Councils, documents about what the faith is that's been preserved from the time of the apostles. So that's something to keep in mind. The third one is be attentive to the analogy of faith. And I won't go into those because I want to get to some other things, but you can look up Dei Verbum and read it. It's really an excellent document. And I think that most Protestants would be surprised as to what they would find there. Secondly, when reading the Scriptures, the Church talks about 2 different senses, or 2 main senses in which the Scriptures are read. The literal meaning and the spiritual meaning. And the spiritual meaning is further subdivided into 3 kind of sub-senses, and that's the allegorical, moral, and anagogical. You can look up the Catechism, paragraph 115, beginning at that paragraph, to learn more about those. So, finally, note that any given passage also can have multiple layers of meaning, or even multiple different kinds of symbolism in it. Take Revelation chapter 12. There's a woman clothed with the sun, gives birth to a male child who will rule the world. Well, the Church sees in that symbolism of Israel, but also of the Church, the new people of God, and also the Virgin Mary. All 3 of them are there. And it's not contradictory to say that. So, to say that the Catholic Church has one interpretation, well, that has to be kind of understood in the right sense. There's a great richness to the Church's teachings and how the Scriptures support them. And it's not just this kind of narrow-minded single way of doing things. Nonetheless, the Church does say, this is true, whereas this is not. And the Holy Spirit has guided the Church into this decision. Let's see here. So let's now look at Protestantism. Remember that law of non-contradiction. Contradictory statements cannot both at the same time be true. But the thousands of different Protestant denominations teach contradictory things about the deposit of the faith. So we can conclude that not all of them are teaching the truth without error. That seems pretty elemental. And the die was cast right from the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. You had the 2 reformers who started it, Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Luther. They realized that they both had interpreted the words of Christ in the Lord's Supper differently. When Jesus says, "This is my body," Luther took it to mean that Jesus was present in, over, through the bread and the wine. Somehow Christ was present there. Zwingli interpreted that to be purely symbolic. No, Jesus is not there somehow. It's purely symbolic. So they clashed. They met to resolve this difference, and neither one would budge. Both of them knew that the other was just a human being without any special authority from God to know the true interpretation, and so they held to their own. And we see in Protestantism this has happened tens of thousands of times since them, 488 years ago. That's been the perennial problem of Protestantism. There's no authority beyond the individual person to arbitrate whose interpretation of the Scriptures is correct. Alright, what else do I have here? Nearing the end. So, we know that God is the God of truth, and that God cannot lie. So we believe that the Scriptures, which He inspired or breathed, are inerrant. They're without error. However, if you interpret them wrongly, you could add error in the doctrines you come up with, right? So it's important that you interpret it correctly. But you've got, the Baptists who say, it's clear from the Scriptures, infants should not be baptized. But the Anglican Protestants say, well, yes, infants should be baptized. You have the Lutherans who say Jesus is present somehow in the Eucharist. The Baptists say, no, it's purely symbolic. They follow Zwingli. You have the Plymouth Brethren, Protestants, a dispensationalist group that say God no longer works or gives miraculous gifts to people that we read about in Acts and in the New Testament. But then you have the Pentecostals who say, what are you talking about? He gives these gifts all the time. And these are not small matters. They're big matters. And matters that split the churches and split them again and again. So what do we know from that? Well, law of non-contradiction. In each one of those cases I mentioned, one of them is wrong. There's no way around it. One of them's right, one of them's wrong. But who and on which cases? Let's see. So, Protestants, because of this, have to just claim, well, that other Protestant, they must not be listening to this Holy Spirit correctly, and I am. And that's ultimately all they can say, because they feel very strongly that what they read, it's obvious that this is the true interpretation, and yet they contradict each other on all these important matters. So, that right there, even leaving Catholicism out of it, and its interpretation of the Scriptures, doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Someone is not reading them correctly. Maybe none of them are. So, God is not a God of chaos and disorder, but the God of truth. He must have provided a way for us to know the truth, and have safeguarded the deposit of faith from error. And that's exactly what He did in His church, which St. Paul called the pillar and bulwark of the truth. In the church, which subsists in the Catholic Church, He has guided her understanding of the Scriptures. They were written within the church, discerned within the church, and the Holy Spirit has been active in the church to lead the rightful authority, who are the successors of the apostles, the bishops, into all truth, deepening their understanding of the truths of the faith. All right, I think that's all for now. Thanks for listening again. I'm Devin Rose. Have a great week.